Turns out billionaires, politicians, and economists really have just been gaslighting us for the last 3 years.
There are a few better places on the internet to find wild left-wing conspiracy theories and total economic illiteracy than TikTok. Today, we're going to break down the crazy left-wing TikTok theory about inflation and explain to you why it doesn't actually make any sense. But first, welcome back to my channel. I'm Brad Polumbo. I cover all the craziest things on the internet, in our politics, and in the LGBT community from a center-right, moderate perspective. If you're new here, do consider subscribing. We've recently crossed the 100K threshold and we're already at 105. I can't believe how fast this page is growing, and I just am so thankful to all of you who've joined me on here. I really can't thank you enough. Don't forget to like and comment as we go along. Now, let's check out what TikTok is saying about inflation, and I'll let you decide for yourself what you think of it, then give you my opinion.
It turns out billionaires, politicians, and economists really have just been gaslighting us for the last 3 years. Yesterday, an explosive economics report was released by a think tank out of DC confirming what you and I and everyday Americans have been screaming from the rooftops for the past 3 years. That these record high price increases that we've experienced in everything from gasoline, lumber, poultry, eggs, and diapers haven't actually been being driven up by necessities, supply chain issues, COVID recovery, or labor shortages. No. It turns out that 53% of all price increases that have quite literally bankrupted middle America have now in fact been confirmed to have been driven by one singular thing: billionaire corporate greed and their record and relentless pursuit of profits. It's as vulgar as it sounds, and I'm sorry to say the outlook doesn't look good.
So I saw this and immediately a bunch of red flags went up. I went and found the actual reporting from The Guardian that this TikTok is based on, and the study that it supposedly cites, which has actually been echoed by everyone at the top levels of Democratic politics, including Senator Elizabeth Warren and a bunch of Democratic members of Congress. So this has really had quite the impact, this report and the online buzz around it. But it's not some peer-reviewed study or anything. It's a report, and that's kind of putting it generously, from a progressive think tank, and I actually read it. It doesn't make any sense. They're not the first ones to spin this notion that corporate greed is what caused the unusually high levels of inflation in 2021 and 2022. In fact, this narrative has been put out there for a while by anti-capitalist types, by socialist types, by progressive types, and this report is just the latest iteration of it. It's never made any sense at all. Yeah, of course corporations and billionaires are greedy and that they want to get richer and they seek profit, but that's always been the case. Nothing about that changed between 2020 and 2021, even though inflation went through the roof. What's more, we saw inflation was worse in some industries than others, but there's literally zero reason to believe that companies or CEOs in some sectors are greedier than those in others. And funnily enough, it's actually not even always true that higher prices always lead to increased profits. Businesses sometimes can and sometimes do increase their profits by lowering their prices because they're able to sell more total units and make a bigger profit overall. All of these are just conceptual Econ 101 problems with this entire narrative that really, for me, stop it from even getting off the ground in terms of taking it seriously. But the actual report cited is just total bunk. One of the pieces of evidence that it supposedly uses to prove that corporate greed is driving inflation is the fact that, according to them, quote, consumer prices are rising much faster than corporations' input costs. They write that while prices for consumers have risen by 3.4% over the last year, input costs for producers have risen by just 1%. The authors even include this handy graph which shows us how greedy companies are raising their prices far beyond their increased costs. But there's one big problem with this approach. If you zoom out and look at the data in a more complete way, they just cherry-picked a very recent time segment, you'll see that over the full time period where we've experienced inflation, actually the producers' costs have been far higher than the consumer price increases. Looking at this graph, you can see that throughout the period when inflation was highest, producer prices actually were higher than the consumer prices, meaning that the costs companies faced were higher than the price increases they passed on to consumers. If we were to run with their socialist thinking, that would require us to believe that during that period, companies were just extra generous and wanted to absorb losses so customers didn't have to pay more. And that suddenly, recently, they got much greedier again, or something? In reality, there were no such sudden fluctuations in greed or corporate profiteering. The entire thing is economic nonsense that was labeled by even the liberal-leaning Washington Post as an inflation conspiracy theory. But that hasn't stopped it from spreading like wildfire on TikTok and in the media, and apparently even reaching the highest levels of our politics. This is really concerning, to see the spread of a blatant conspiracy theory about the causes of inflation that I'm afraid will fool a lot of the public who doesn't have extensive knowledge about how economics works in the first place. That'll work out great for these people in the government. They'll get away with how their actual policy failures contributed to the inflation, whether it was the massive trillion-dollar overspending over stimulus or the reckless money printing and monetary policy creating trillions of dollars out of thin air during the pandemic. No, they'll just all blame it on the corporate boogeyman, and the audience will look away. The voters won't hold them accountable for it. It's a perfect explanation for inflation from their perspective. It just doesn't happen to be true. But for these TikTokers, evidently, that's of no concern. All right, guys, that's it for this video. Let me know in the comments below what you thought, and if you're still here, you must have found something interesting or insightful, so do drop a like, and maybe even consider subscribing and joining this community. We're growing so fast, I really can't thank you enough for all joining me on here, and I'll see you all in my next video. But if you're somehow not sick of me yet, you can go here or here to check out some of my other content you might just enjoy.